Start with the bank, not with a discovery, not with a date, just the wall of frozen dirt that the river is eating. The Yana runs north across the top of Siberia and empties into the Arctic Ocean. For most of the year it is a road of ice. For a few weeks in summer it is a brown, cold, hurrying thing, and it does what rivers do to a soft bank: it undercuts. It slumps, it takes the ground away in slabs. The ground here is not soil in the way you know soil. It's permafrost silt and sand and old ice welded together, frozen through for tens of thousands of years. When the river cuts into it, the ice inside melts and the whole face gives way at once. What was sealed comes out. In 2001, what came out was bone. Among the bones was a length of horn from a woolly rhinoceros, and the horn had been worked, shaped, turned into something. That single object gave the place its name, and the name stuck even though it's slightly misleading: the Yana Rhinoceros Horn Site, which everyone shortened to Yana RHS and eventually just to Yana. Here is the number that matters, and I want to put it down before anything else because everything in this episode hangs off it. 71 degrees north, that's not northern, that's not cold country. 71 degrees north is well above the Arctic Circle. It is further north than almost anywhere people live today without a supply chain behind them. There is no agriculture at that latitude. There is no forest. In winter, the sun does not clear the horizon for weeks, and the ground does not thaw for most of the year. And the site is about 32,000 years old. Take a moment with that, because the instinct is to file it as one more old date, and it isn't. For most of the last century, the working assumption in archaeology was that the high Arctic was the last place people reached. It's the hardest environment on the planet that isn't literally sterile. The reasonable expectation was that humans arrived there late after farming, after the ice retreated, after everything else had been solved. Yana breaks that expectation by roughly 20,000 years. People were living at 71 degrees north before the last glacial maximum, before the coldest phase of the Ice Age. They were up there while the world was still cooling toward its worst. So the question this episode is really about isn't when. The date is well established, and I'm not going to spend an hour defending it. The question is how. What does a person actually need, physically, to hold a position at that latitude with no metal, no engine, no imported food, and no way to leave in winter? And the answer that comes out of the ground at Yana is not the answer most people would guess. It's this: not a spear, a needle. To understand the site, you have to fix the landscape, and the landscape is gone, not changed, gone. There is no modern equivalent to walk into. 32,000 years ago, most of northern Eurasia was covered by something researchers call the Mammoth Steppe. It ran from Western Europe across Siberia and over the land bridge into Alaska and the Yukon, an unbroken belt of cold, dry grassland thousands of miles wide. It was, by area, one of the largest single ecosystems the world has had since. The word steppe is doing important work there. This was not tundra as you picture it, not sodden moss and standing bog water. It was dry. The air was cold enough that it held very little moisture, so snowfall was light, and light snow is the hinge the whole system turns on. Light snow means grass stays reachable in winter. Reachable grass means large grazing animals can stay through the dark months instead of migrating out. And large grazing animals staying through the dark months is the only reason a human being can be at 71 degrees north in January at all. So the mammoth steppe carried a load of animals that sounds implausible now. Woolly mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, steppe bison, wild horse in enormous numbers, reindeer, musk ox, cave lion following all of it, wolves, Arctic fox, hare. That's the pantry. That's the entire reason this story is possible. The people at Yana were not surviving in an empty white desert. They were living in cold grassland stocked with meat, and the meat did not leave in winter. The site itself sits on the lower Yana, on high ground above the floodplain, near where several channels braid together. That's not accidental. Braided channels are where animals cross. High ground above them is where you sit to watch the crossings, and it's where you camp so the spring melt doesn't take your camp. We should be careful though, because sight makes it sound like one thing. It isn't. Yana is a complex, several localities strung along the same terrace, excavated over years with material scattered across a broad area. Some of it is a living surface. Some of it is a workshop floor. Some of it is a place where animals were butchered and the bones left where they fell. And that scatter is the first honest complication of the episode. When you read that Yana produced thousands of objects, those objects did not all come from one moment. They accumulated. People came back. How often and for how long each time is a genuinely open question, and I'll come back to it later because it bears directly on how impressive this all is. But even at its most conservative reading, the picture holds. People were on this ground in the deep Arctic, tens of thousands of years earlier than the old models allowed, and they were not scraping by at the edge of capability. They were making decorated objects. You don't decorate things when you're one bad day from dying. Decoration is what capacity looks like. Now the physics, because the physics is the plot. A human being is a tropical animal. That is not a figure of speech, it's a description of our thermal envelope. We are hairless, we're built to shed heat. We sweat over almost our entire skin surface, and our core has to stay within a few degrees of 37 Celsius or we stop working. Every one of those traits is an adaptation for staying cool in an African environment. None of them help here. At 71 degrees north in the depth of an ice age winter, air temperatures well below -40 are ordinary. With wind across open steppe, the number that matters to exposed skin is worse. Here's what that does to an unprotected body, and I want to be plain about it because it's the constraint every other decision at Yana bends around. Your body defends the core first. Blood is pulled back from the hands, the feet, the nose, the ears. Those parts get colder, and they get colder fast because now they're barely being perfused. Manual dexterity starts degrading long before there's any real danger to your life, and dexterity is how you make fire, handle tools, tie knots, and fix the clothing you're wearing. That's the trap. The cold takes your hands first, and your hands are the thing you'd use to solve the cold, and fire on its own does not solve it. This is the point people miss most often. A fire in the open at -40 with wind is a device for warming one side of you at a time. It heats by radiation, which means it heats the surface pointed at it, and the surface pointed away is still radiating heat into a black sky. You can cook with it, you can thaw water, you can gather round it in a shelter and make the shelter livable. But you cannot walk to a hunting stand with a fire, and hunting is what you have to do. There's also a fuel problem that gets glossed over. There are no trees. On the mammoth steppe at that latitude you are burning bone, dung, and whatever driftwood the river delivers. Bone burns, it burns well when it's greasy and you've got a hot base going, but every fire is a logistics decision. Fuel has to be carried or the camp has to sit where fuel is. So fire is necessary and not sufficient. Shelter is necessary and not sufficient. You have to leave it. The thing that has to work is the layer that goes with you, clothing, and not clothing in the sense of a hide thrown over your shoulders. To function outdoors for hours at those temperatures, you need garments that are fitted and closed. Fitted because the insulation is the trapped still air and a loose garment ventilates. Every movement pumps warm air out at the neck and cuffs and pulls cold air in. Closed because any gap is a chimney. You need sleeves that attach, not drape. You need a hood that seals around the face. You need trousers and you need footwear that is separately constructed with a sole. You need, in short, tailoring, the joining of shaped pieces into a three-dimensional garment that follows the body. And tailoring is not something you can improvise with an awl and a thong. An awl punches a hole. You can lace hide together with an awl and a strip of sinew and get something. But a lace through punched holes is loose. The holes are large and large holes leak. A fine, tight seam, many small stitches, thin thread, small holes is a different object. It's windproof, and to make it you need something an awl cannot do. You need to pull the thread through with the same motion that makes the hole. You need a needle with an eye. Yana produced more than 200 needles, complete ones and fragments, in bone and in mammoth ivory. It is one of the largest assemblages of eyed needles known from anywhere in the Paleolithic world, and it comes from the coldest, most remote, earliest place on the list. That is not a coincidence, and it isn't luck of preservation. It's the signature of what these people were actually doing. Let me slow down on the object itself because the significance is in the engineering. To make an eyed needle out of bone, you start by splitting a long bone into a blank, a narrow rod, straight-grained. You grind that rod down, rolling it against an abrasive stone until it's round in section and tapering. You're now holding something perhaps 2 millimeters thick at the eye end. Then you have to make a hole through it, through the middle, without splitting it. That is the hard part, and it's the part that defines the technology. You're drilling a hole roughly 1 millimeter across through a rod 2 millimeters across in a material that wants to split along its grain using stone. The tolerance for error is essentially zero. Push too hard and the blank splits and the last hour is gone. Drill off-center and the wall on one side is too thin and it breaks the first time it's pulled through hide. We find the failures. Blank split at the eye, snapped shafts, half-drilled heads. That's normal for any craft assemblage, and it tells you the process was difficult and routine at the same time, difficult enough to fail often, routine enough that failing was acceptable. And here is the detail I find hardest to let go of. Some of the Yana needles are decorated. incised, marked with fine lines along the shaft, on an object the size of a matchstick made at 71 degrees north in the middle of an ice age by someone working with stone tools and daylight that lasts a few hours. You can construct sensible reasons. Marks may identify an owner. They may mark a maker. They may be a tally of something. Any of those could be true, and we can't test between them. I want to be honest that this is a place where the evidence runs out and interpretation begins. But whatever the reason, the fact underneath it doesn't move. Somebody spent time they did not have to spend on a tool small enough to lose in a seam. That is a person with enough margin in their life to care what a needle looks like. Now, what does the needle buy you in hard terms? It buys a seam with small holes and a lot of them. Insulation in cold weather clothing is trapped air, and trapped air escapes through gaps. A lace and punch join has few, large holes and slack between them. A stitched seam has many small holes, each one filled by the thread that made it and the two hide faces pulled into contact. The difference between those two joins across a whole garment is the difference between clothing that lets you stand still outdoors and clothing that only works while you're generating heat by moving. And hunting is mostly standing still, watching a crossing, waiting at a kill. That's when you freeze. There's a second thing tailoring buys, which is repair. A garment that's sewn can be unsewn, patched, resized, and recut. Over a winter that matters as much as the original construction because hide fails, and it fails at the seams and at the wear points, and a person whose coat can't be fixed in the field is a person on a countdown. So when we say Yana had needles, that's not a footnote about crafts. That is the survival technology. The mammoths and the spear points get the thumbnail, but the thing that actually let a human body hold a position at 71 degrees north through an ice age winter was fitted, sewn, windproof clothing, and the only way to make that is a needle with an eye and someone skilled enough to use it for hours. Which raises a question the site is very bad at answering, and I'd rather raise it than let it sit unsaid. We don't know who was doing the sewing. There is no evidence at Yana that assigns this work to one part of the population rather than another, and anybody who tells you otherwise is importing an assumption from somewhere else. What we can say is that it was skilled, that it was time expensive, and that it was as essential as hunting. Whoever held that skill held the group's life in their hands, now the strangest number in the assemblage, and the one that changed how I read the site. The animal remains at Yana are dominated by the big steppe fauna you'd expect: horse in quantity, bison, reindeer. But there is also an enormous number of hare. Enormous. Thousands of bones, enough that this isn't opportunistic snacking, it's mass procurement. Somebody was taking hares systematically in numbers as a program, and that doesn't make sense as a food strategy. This is where it gets interesting. Hare is famously bad as a staple. The meat is extremely lean, and a diet of lean meat without fat is not merely unsatisfying, it's dangerous. Protein poisoning is a real physiological limit. The liver and kidneys can only process so much protein without accompanying fat or carbohydrate, and past that point you get sick and keep getting sicker while eating. Arctic peoples in the historical record knew this well, and the phenomenon is even named for the animal. So if you're living in an environment where fat is the limiting nutrient, and you're surrounded by horse and bison and mammoth that carry serious fat loads, hunting hares in the thousands as a meat program is close to irrational. Unless you're not doing it for the meat. The likeliest reading, and I want to flag that this is a reading, not a proven fact, is fur. Hare fur is remarkable insulation for its weight. It's fine, it's dense, and it traps air better than most heavy pelts. What it isn't is durable, it wears out fast, which is exactly why you'd need a lot of it and keep needing more. Put those together and a use case falls out. Hare fur as lining, as the layer against the skin inside a tougher outer hide. As trim around a hood opening where breath freezes and abrades, as stuffing in footwear, as the insulation for infants who cannot generate or hold heat the way an adult can. That last one deserves a sentence of its own. A baby at 71 degrees north in winter is a thermal emergency continuously. Small bodies have high surface area relative to volume. They lose heat fast and they can't shiver effectively. If there are children at Yana, and we'll get to the evidence that there were, then somebody solved that problem, and the solution had to be a wearable one. So the hare bones stop being a curiosity and start being the other half of the needle story. The needles are the tool, the hairs are the raw material. Together, they're a clothing industry running above the Arctic Circle 32,000 years ago, and the scale of the hare assemblage tells you it wasn't a one-off, it was maintained repeatedly over time. And it needed thread, which is its own quiet problem. Sinew, most likely split from tendon, dried and separated into fibers fine enough to pass through a needle a millimeter across. Prepared thread is a stock item. You'd want a supply of it going into winter, the way you'd want a supply of fuel. None of that is heroic. It's the opposite of heroic. It's inventory management in a place that kills you if you get it wrong. Now the mammoths, because this is where the popular version of Yana and the evidence part company. Yana gives us something rare and unambiguous, mammoth bones with weapon damage. Shoulder blades with holes punched through them, and in some cases fragments still in the wound, pieces of stone point and pieces of ivory shaft embedded in the bone. That is about as direct as archaeological evidence gets. It isn't a butchered carcass which could have been scavenged. It isn't an association which could be coincidence. It's a projectile in the animal. Somebody threw or thrust a weapon into a living mammoth at this place. So, mammoth hunters, except that when you look at how often it happened, the picture changes shape. The pattern in the evidence suggests mammoth hunting at Yana was sporadic rather than routine, not the daily bread. And the reading that fits the material best is that when they did hunt mammoth, they did it substantially for the ivory, because ivory was the raw material they needed and could not get any other way in the quantity they wanted. This is the part that reorganizes the whole story. We tend to assume prehistoric people hunted the biggest animal available because it was the most meat. But meat is not the only resource, and at Yana it may not have been the scarce one. Horse and bison and reindeer were on the ground in numbers, and they are far easier to kill and far easier to process than a mammoth. What horse and bison cannot give you is a long, dense, workable rod of material. Ivory can be split, ground, straightened, and carved. It makes shafts, it makes points. It makes needles, it makes vessels. It's the closest thing that environment has to engineered stock material, and the only source walking around is a mammoth. There's a caveat here I don't want to skip because it's a real one. Tusks can also be collected. The steppe was littered with dead mammoths, animals die, permafrost preserves, rivers expose. Scavenged tusk from a long-dead animal is drier and more brittle than fresh, and workers can tell the difference, so the presence of good fresh ivory is meaningful. But some fraction of the ivory at any site like this could have been picked up rather than hunted, and honest treatments say so. Still, the embedded points are not ambiguous. At least some of these animals were hunted. And hunting a mammoth is not a thing you do casually. Consider the problem. The animal is several tons, its hide is thick, and under the hide is a fat layer that stops a thrown weapon almost as effectively as armor. You are on open ground with no cover and nothing to climb. It can kill you incidentally without deciding to. And the killing wound has to reach something vital through all of that. Which is why the ivory foreshaft matters. A composite weapon stone tip, ivory foreshaft, wooden or bone main shaft concentrates force at the point and lets the shaft carry momentum. It's a system, not a stick, and the components tell us the system existed here. So the corrected picture is this: these were not primarily mammoth hunters. They were steppe hunters who took horse and bison and reindeer for the calories and the fat, and who periodically undertook a difficult and dangerous specialist operation to obtain ivory, the raw material their toolkit depended on. The mammoth wasn't dinner. The mammoth was the hardware store. Roughly 2,500 worked objects in bone and ivory have come out of Yana. That number needs unpacking because 2,500 objects can mean two very different things. It can mean a treasure chamber, or it can mean a place where people worked day after day and left the byproducts where they fell. Yana is the second one, and the second one is far more informative. What you're looking at is a production site, blanks at every stage, finished tools, broken tools, failed attempts, waste. The residue of a craft economy that ran long enough and often enough to leave a thick record. There are vessels, bowls worked out of ivory, some with notched decoration cut around them. Think about the labor in that. To hollow a bowl from ivory with stone tools is days of work. You would not do it for a container you could make faster from hide or bark, unless the object meant something beyond holding things. There are what look like knives and points and shafts. There are pieces whose function we honestly cannot name, and the responsible thing is to say so rather than invent a use. And there's the object that named the site, the worked rhinoceros horn. Woolly rhinoceros horn is keratin, not bone, and it behaves differently under a blade. It's tough, slightly flexible, and it holds an edge shape well. Somebody chose it deliberately for something. Now stand back from the individual objects and look at what the assemblage implies about time. Craft at this level is not something you do in the gaps between emergencies. Grinding a needle blank takes hours. Hollowing a vessel takes days. Drilling a bead takes minutes each, and there are thousands of beads. Somebody had hours indoors, warm enough for fine finger work with light. That's a claim about the whole system. It means the food supply was reliable enough to buy leisure. It means shelter was good enough to sit still in. It means in a place where being outdoors is a hazard, they had somewhere worth being indoors. We should be careful about the dwellings themselves. Sites of this era elsewhere in the Mammoth Steppe have famous bone structures, mammoth bone arranged into rings and frames. At Yana, the evidence for architecture is less spectacular and more debated, and I'm not going to hand you a confident reconstruction of what these shelters looked like, because the confident reconstructions in circulation are largely artistic. What the assemblage does argue indirectly but strongly is that whatever they lived in worked. You cannot produce 2,500 worked objects while cold. Then there's the number that stops people. 6,000 beads made from mammoth ivory, from stone, from animal teeth, drilled, shaped, sized. 6,000 of them from one site complex above the Arctic Circle 32,000 years ago. Let's do the arithmetic that never appears in the headline. Every one of those beads had to be individually shaped and individually perforated with a stone drill. Call it a few minutes each if you're skilled and the material cooperates, and much longer when it doesn't, because drilled beads split, and the split ones are in the assemblage too. 6,000 beads is, conservatively, hundreds of hours of work. Somewhere in the region of weeks of a person's life spent making objects that do nothing. Except, of course, they do something, and this is where the episode has to be careful, because it's the point at which archaeology is most tempted to tell you a story it can't support. Here's what we can say with confidence. The beads were made to be attached to something. They're perforated, which means they were strung or sewn. Many bead assemblages of this era are found in patterns that indicate they were fixed to clothing rather than worn as loose necklaces. And bead-decorated clothing is one of the most widely documented ways human societies mark who someone is. Here's what we can't say. We can't tell you what the patterns meant. We can't tell you whether a particular arrangement marked a family, a role, an age, an achievement, or a marriage. We can't tell you whether the beads were made by their wearers or given. Anyone who tells you otherwise is guessing with confidence, which is the most common failure mode in this field. What the sheer number does tell us is about the society, and that inference is solid. 6,000 beads is not one person expressing themselves. It's a population, plural, over time investing serious labor in visible identity, and visible identity implies an audience. You mark yourself for people who can read the marks. That means there were enough people meeting often enough for the marks to mean anything. That's an important correction to the mental image most people carry. The instinct is to picture a lone family clinging on at the edge of the world. The beads argue against it. They argue for a social landscape, groups who met, who could tell each other apart and who cared too. There's a second implication, quieter and more interesting. Materials. Some of the bead stone is not what you'd pick up on that riverbank. Material moving across a landscape means either people moving a long way or things being passed hand to hand between groups. Either way, the site was not isolated, it was connected to something larger, which sets up the question the next part of this episode has to answer. If these people were connected, numerous, skilled, and equipped, what happened to them? Everything in this episode so far has come from things people made. Now we get something else. We get the people. Among the material at Yana were human teeth. Milk teeth, baby teeth from two individuals, both, as the genetics later established, boys. They are not a burial. There's no grave, no arrangement, no grave goods. These are shed teeth of the sort a child loses naturally, found in the occupation material, which in its own way is more intimate than a burial. A burial is a ceremony. A shed milk tooth is a Tuesday. Two children were living at 71 degrees north, 31,600 years ago, and they lost teeth there the way children do. I want to sit with that for a second before the genetics, because the genetics will pull us into deep time and abstractions, and this detail deserves to land first. Children mean the site was not a hunting expedition. Hunting parties do not bring small children to the Arctic in winter. Children mean a resident group, families, people who were living there, not visiting. And children in that environment means somebody solved every problem this episode has described continuously for years, well enough that a child survived long enough to lose a baby tooth. Small bodies lose heat faster than large ones. A child cannot be relied on to notice frostbite starting. A child has to be carried or moved slowly, and either way somebody's thermal budget is being spent on them. Everything about a child at 71 degrees north is expensive. The presence of those teeth turns the site from an achievement into a life. Now the genetics, because those two teeth carried DNA, and when it was sequenced in 2019 it did something that very rarely happens. It didn't refine an existing picture. It added a population nobody knew existed. The two boys belonged to a population researchers named the ancient North Siberians. They were not a local curiosity. They were not a small isolated pocket. The ancient North Siberians were a distinct lineage that, by 31,600 years ago, was established across northern Eurasia, a genuinely enormous range. Two baby teeth from an eroding river bank in the Arctic, and they rewrote a chapter of human population history. That's not a figure of speech. Before that sequencing, this population was not in the story at all. To understand what the Yana boys are, you need one idea, and it's an idea people find slippery, so let's build it carefully. Populations are not boxes, they're flows. A group splits, the parts drift apart, they change, sometimes they meet again and mix. Ancient DNA lets us see where a sampled individual sits in that flow, which other groups they share ancestry with, and roughly when the sharing stopped. So when we say the Yana boys belong to the ancient North Siberians, what we mean is that their genomes sit on a branch that had already separated from other known branches, and that this branch turns up again and again across the north. Now the connections, and this is where it gets genuinely startling. There's a famous individual from a site near Lake Baikal, thousands of kilometers south and west of Yana, dating to around 24,000 years ago. That individual belongs to a group researchers call the ancient North Eurasians, and the ancient North Eurasians can be understood as a descendant lineage of the same ancient North Siberian stock the Yana boys belong to. So one lineage 7,000 years apart, spanning a huge stretch of northern Eurasia. That's the first surprise. This was not a local population, it was continental. The second surprise is where that lineage turns up next. Native American populations derive a substantial portion of their ancestry, on the order of 40%, from the ancient North Eurasian lineage. The rest comes from an East Asian source. The founding population of the Americas is a mixture of the two, which means that when you trace the ancestry of the first peoples of the Americas backward, a large fraction of that ancestry runs north and west into the same deep northern Eurasian lineage that the Yana boys sit near the base of. And that is why Yana is always described as being about the peopling of the Americas. The connection is real and the arithmetic is real, but here's where the popular version starts to bend the evidence, and this episode is going to unbend it. The Yana people crossed into the Americas is not what the genetics says. It's not even close. The Yana boys are not ancestors of Native Americans in any direct sense. They're a related branch, relatives of the population that contributed part of the ancestry, not that population itself, and separated from the American story by many thousands of years and a great deal of population movement. Being related to an ancestor is not the same as being one. Your great-uncle is not your ancestor. The distinction sounds pedantic until you see how much weight gets put on it in documentaries. And the reason the distinction matters here is not pedantry. It's that the real story is stranger and sadder than the tidy one. Here's what happened to the ancient North Siberians. They were largely replaced. Not entirely. Lineages rarely vanish without trace, and their genetic contribution persists diluted in later populations. But the population that was living across northern Eurasia at 31,600 years ago did not simply continue and become the people who live there now. Later populations of northeastern Siberia derive most of their ancestry from other sources that moved in afterward. The genetic record of northeastern Siberia is a record of turnover. Populations arrive, hold the ground for a while, and are succeeded. The ancient North Siberians are one layer in that stack and not the top one. There's a later individual from the Kolyma region, around 10,000 years old, who turns out to be the closest known Old World relative of the population ancestral to Native Americans. Notice what that phrasing means. 10,000 years, 20,000 years after Yana. The connection between deep Siberia and the Americas runs through populations that came later, in a north that had already been reshuffled more than once. So the honest summary is this. The Yana people were an early, widespread, technically formidable northern population. They are related to the ancestry that eventually reached the Americas, and their own line as a population mostly ended. I want to be exact about what that does and doesn't mean, because replaced is a word that carries a lot of unearned drama. It doesn't necessarily mean violence. It doesn't necessarily mean a single event. Population replacement in the deep past is usually a slow arithmetic thing. One group has slightly better years, slightly more surviving children, slightly more range over centuries. The other group thins. There may be absorption, intermarriage, and gradual dilution rather than any moment you could point to, but it also doesn't mean nothing. A lineage that spanned a continent at 31,600 years ago is a marginal contributor by 10,000. Something happened in between, and the leading candidate is the obvious one, the last glacial maximum. Around 26 to 19,000 years ago, the Ice Age reached its worst. Ice sheets grew to their maximum extent, sea level dropped by more than 100 meters, and the mammoth steppe, the ecosystem this entire episode depends on, contracted hard. That's the part that matters, not the ice itself. The high Arctic of Siberia was largely unglaciated, too dry for the ice sheets to build. What changed was the grass. Colder and drier meant less productive grassland. Less grassland meant fewer grazing animals. Fewer grazing animals meant the calorie base under a human population at 71 degrees north thinned out, and it was never generous. The likeliest reading of the evidence is that the far north was largely abandoned during the coldest phase, with people surviving in refuges further south where the steppe still worked, and moving back north only when conditions improved. I'll flag the uncertainty honestly. The exact pattern of abandonment and return in northeastern Siberia is still being worked out, and absence of sites is weaker evidence than presence of them. What we can say is that the archaeological record thins dramatically, and the genetic record shows the lineage losing ground. If you want the human version of that, it's this. Yana was not a failure. Yana worked. These people solved the hardest environment on Earth with needles, hare fur, ivory, and organization, and they held it for a long time. Then the environment moved. The grass thinned, the herds thinned, and no amount of skill fixes a calorie deficit that runs for 1,000 years. They were not outcompeted because they were primitive. They were beaten by arithmetic. Before the ending, the part that documentaries usually skip. Everything I've told you rests on a set of inferences, and some of them are load-bearing. Here's where they could be wrong. Start with the most serious problem, which is that the site is being destroyed as we look at it. Yana was found because the river cut into it. The river is still cutting. Material that would answer questions has already gone downstream, and more goes every year. We are reading a book that is being torn up from the front. Second, the assemblage accumulated. 2,500 worked objects and 6,000 beads did not appear in one season. They are the sum of an unknown number of occupations over an unknown span. If people came back to this spot for 1,000 years, then the number of people present at any one time might be small, and a large connected society becomes a much weaker claim. I lean toward the richer reading because craft production of that intensity is hard to generate with a handful of people passing through. But I want you to know the thin reading exists and is not stupid. Third, seasonality. We do not know for certain that Yana was occupied through the winter. It's possible people came north for the summer and went south when the dark came. That would change the story completely. The needles and the fur would be for a hard season elsewhere, not for a polar night here. What argues against a summer-only reading is the whole tailoring industry. Clothing at that intensity is winter equipment. And the presence of children argues for residence rather than expedition. But argues for is not proves, and anyone who tells you the winter occupation is settled is going further than the evidence. Fourth, and this is the one I find most limiting, we have milk teeth and we have genomes and we have almost nothing in between. No burials to speak of, no skeletons. We know the population's shape in the genetic sense, and we know almost nothing about individual lives, how long they lived, what they died of, whether they were healthy. Fifth, the beads. I said material moving across a landscape implies connection. That's the standard reading and I think it's right, but implies is carrying weight. Stone can travel in a river as well as in a hand. And sixth, the largest one. The genetic story, the ancient North Siberians, the relationship to the ancestry that reached the Americas, the later replacement, rests on a small number of sequenced individuals. 2 boys here, a handful of others across an enormous region and tens of thousands of years. Each new genome has, so far, complicated the picture rather than confirming it, which means this episode will age. Some of what I've told you will be revised, and the revision will most likely come from a site nobody has found yet, or a genome nobody has sequenced yet. That's not a weakness in the field, that's what the field is. The version of this story from 20 years ago didn't have the ancient North Siberians in it at all. So here's where we end. 32,000 years ago, at 71 degrees north, people held ground that everything about the human body says we should not be able to hold. They did it without metal, without engines, without a supply line, and without any way to leave in winter. They did it by being extremely good at a small number of things. They made fitted clothing with needles they drilled themselves. They took hares in the thousands for fur nobody could eat. They hunted the largest animal on the landscape occasionally and carefully, mostly for a material they could not otherwise get. They made containers and tools out of ivory, and they made 6,000 beads which did nothing at all except tell other people who they were. That last one is the part I keep returning to. Because the beads and the decorated needles are the evidence that these were not survival machines. A survival machine does not carve a pattern into a needle. A survival machine does not spend weeks of its life drilling ornaments. Those things happen when there's slack in the system, when the food holds, the shelter works, and there's an evening with light and warm fingers and nothing urgent. They were not clinging on. They were living there, and then the grass thinned and the herds thinned, and over a span longer than all of recorded history, their population lost ground and was largely replaced. Their lineage persists in living people only as a diluted trace, and the popular version of their story hands their achievement to somebody else, to the founders of the Americas, who were relatives rather than descendants. They are not the ancestors. They were a branch, and the branch mostly ended. I don't think that makes them a tragedy. I think it makes them the more honest version of what usually happened. Most human populations that have ever existed are not anyone's direct ancestors. Most branches end. Ours is the strange case, not theirs. What they left is not descendants. It's a demonstration that with the right clothing, the right organization, and enough skill, a tropical animal can hold the top of the world through an ice age. And its 2 baby teeth in an eroding riverbank that turned out to